Ladies and gentlemen, the Enlightenment was not just candles in salons. It was a rebellion against kings and dogma, a demand that reason replace superstition and that people, not prophets, be the center of society. Today, we need that fire again. Reason cannot mean markets always know best. Science must be public and accountable, not locked in corporate labs. Humanism must confront exploitation, not cushion it. And progress? It's not tech stock surges. It's justice, equality, dignity. Enlightenment now means rising up against the economic rules written by and for the ruling class. Ladies and gentlemen, the Enlightenment was not just a philosophical era, it was a rupture in the structure of power, a moment when the majority began to question the divine right of monarchs and the inherited privileges of a narrow ruling elite. This challenge to authority did not emerge in a vacuum. It was born out of social conditions where the masses were denied access to knowledge, to voice, and to agency. When we talk about reason today, it must not be separated from its historical role as a political tool wielded against illegitimate rule. In its purest sense, reason challenged the idea that some people were born to rule and others to obey. But in our time, this powerful legacy has been co-opted. Reason has been hollowed out, packaged, and sold back to us as managerial logic, corporate rationality, and neoliberal inevitability. It is now used to justify mass layoffs, the gig economy, austerity policies, and the privatization of public goods, all in the name of what is efficient or logical for markets. This is not the reason of the Enlightenment. This is reason in service of capital, detached from the interests of the people. When reason is truly rooted in the needs of society, it becomes revolutionary. It means asking why, in a world of technological abundance, so many go hungry. It means examining how wealth is created, and more importantly, who controls its distribution. Enlightenment reason once posed radical questions. Why should the clergy and aristocrats monopolize knowledge? Why should workers remain poor while kings built palaces? Today, we must ask, why should billionaires own data, control AI, and manipulate global finance while workers are told to upskill, hustle, and be grateful for precarious labor? These questions are not technical, they are political. And reason, real reason, demands we pursue them to their logical conclusions, even if they shake the foundations of modern capitalism. To reclaim the Enlightenment means not just talking about ideas, but acting upon them. We cannot treat reason as something abstract or neutral. Neutrality in the face of injustice is complicity. Reason today must be material, rooted in the lived experiences of working people. It must demand that our economic systems are evaluated not by GDP growth, but by how they serve the needs of the many. It means interrogating policies that claim to be logical but serve narrow interests. When a government says it cannot afford universal health care, we must use reason to ask why military budgets grow unchallenged. When austerity is justified as necessary, reason must uncover the hidden transfer of public wealth to private hands. And when corporate media label radical economic reforms as unrealistic, reason must reveal who benefits from that narrative. What Enlightenment thinkers began? This struggle against irrational authority and superstition. We must now continue against new forms of dogma, market fundamentalism, technocratic elitism, and the worship of private property. These modern dogmas are cloaked in the language of expertise, metrics, and innovation. But at their core, they reinforce inequality. They tell us that exploitation is inevitable, that resistance is futile, that the economy is a neutral machine rather than a social construction shaped by power and class. Reason must tear away this illusion. It must expose how decisions that shape our lives, how much we earn, whether we can retire, whether our children can go to school or breathe clean air, are not made by natural laws, but by human institutions structured to maintain privilege. This is where science enters the picture, not as a replacement for reason, but as its ally. Enlightenment-era science was revolutionary because it challenged dogma and sought empirical truth. But science, too, has been captured. When research is funded by oil companies, when pharmaceutical patents prioritize shareholder value over global health, when agribusiness controls genetic information, science is no longer a public good. It becomes a tool for profit extraction. The tragedy is not that science has become ideological, but that it pretends to be neutral while serving private capital. Reclaiming enlightenment means democratizing science, opening up research to public control, ensuring that it serves human need and not corporate greed. We must also re-examine humanism, which in its original form rejected the idea that authority came from gods or monarchs, and instead asserted that human beings, through collective reasoning and cooperation, could shape their destinies. Yet contemporary humanism often functions as a hollow moral veneer, invoked in speeches but ignored in policy. True humanism means solidarity. It means recognizing the dignity of every worker, every community, every person struggling against poverty, racism, displacement, and exclusion. It means designing economic systems that prioritize well-being over profits, that distribute resources based on need, not market power. And this brings us to the final Enlightenment value, progress. But progress for whom? Too often, what is called progress has meant the advancement of elite interests at the expense of the masses. Technological development without redistribution leads to deeper inequality. Economic growth without justice leads to exploitation. Progress must be measured not by the expansion of luxury for the few, but by the expansion of opportunity, health, and freedom for the many. And again, reason must guide us here, not the false reason of market calculus, but the real reason of democratic deliberation and class analysis. Why does progress mean a new iPhone every year, but not a raise for the teachers educating our children? Why does it mean private rockets for billionaires, but not safe housing for the homeless? This is the central contradiction of capitalist modernity. Immense productive capacity is matched by immense inequality, and reason is distorted to justify it all. Enlightenment now must mean radicalizing its legacy. It must mean asking dangerous questions, challenging the sacred cows of capitalism, and imagining new economic institutions built on cooperation, equity, and sustainability. We must refuse to separate reason from justice, science from democracy, humanism from socialism, and progress from the real, material liberation of people. Only then can the Enlightenment project be completed, not as a museum piece, not as a set of ideas in books, but as a living struggle for a world that makes sense, not just in logic, but in life. Ladies and gentlemen, science must not be a domain monopolized by corporations and elite universities, divorced from the lived reality of ordinary people. The Enlightenment view of science was grounded in the idea that knowledge could liberate humanity from fear, superstition, and arbitrary authority. But that liberating potential has been distorted in today's capitalist structure, where science is often redirected to serve private profit over public good. Pharmaceutical companies, for instance, do not prioritize curing diseases as a social mission but maximizing returns for shareholders. Research into life-saving treatments is throttled by patent law, regulatory capture, and pricing structures that make vital drugs inaccessible to millions. This is not a failure of science itself, but a consequence of allowing private capital to dominate scientific agendas. The very tools that could improve human life are instead used to deepen inequality and commodify health, turning the sick into revenue streams. Science, as practiced under capitalism, is driven by what will generate profit, not by what is most necessary for society. Climate science has issued warnings for decades about environmental collapse. Yet fossil fuel companies have funded misinformation campaigns to delay action. Scientists have revealed the dangers of industrial agriculture, but policy continues to subsidize monocultures and chemical-dependent farming. There are breakthroughs in renewable energy, sustainable housing, and ecological restoration, but implementation lags behind because vested interests profit from the status quo. In this system, scientific knowledge is divorced from action because decision-making is concentrated in the hands of the wealthy few, not the democratic many. A society that takes the Enlightenment seriously must bring science back under public, democratic control, funded, directed, and evaluated based on human need and ecological sustainability. Public funding of science is not enough if it replicates elite interests. What matters is who sets the research agenda, who benefits from the results, and who has access to the knowledge produced. Universities, once bastions of public learning, are increasingly corporatized. Grants flow to projects that promise patents, corporate partnerships, and marketable applications. Students are trained not to ask foundational questions about power, justice, and class, but to become efficient laborers in the knowledge economy. The scientific establishment becomes less a force for enlightenment and more an engine for technocratic capitalism. To truly democratize science, we must build institutions that are accountable to communities, workers, and marginalized voices. Science must be participatory, shaped by public deliberation, and responsive to those who are most affected by its outcomes. Technological development is often confused with scientific progress, but the two are not synonymous. Technology can extend human freedom, but it can also intensify surveillance, exploitation, and alienation. The algorithms that determine credit scores, job prospects, and prison sentences are not neutral. They embed the values and interests of those who design them. Artificial intelligence, praised as the next frontier of innovation, is trained on biased data, deployed to cut labor costs, and used to monitor workers with brutal efficiency. Scientific tools become extensions of class power when they are not governed by democratic oversight. The Enlightenment ideal of science as a universal human endeavor is betrayed when its fruits are privatized and weaponized against the working class. This is why reclaiming science means rethinking ownership, control, and purpose. There is also a profound class divide in scientific literacy and access. In many working class and rural communities, scientific institutions appear distant, alien, or even hostile. This is not because people are anti-science by nature, but because they have been systematically excluded from its benefits while bearing the brunt of its costs. Factories pollute their air and water in the name of industrial progress. Pesticides and chemicals invade their ecosystems, yet they have little say in environmental policy. Medical deserts leave them untreated, yet pharmaceutical profits soar. If we want science to regain public trust, it must stop serving capital at the expense of the common good. It must be embedded in community needs, accountable to democratic governance, and oriented toward collective empowerment rather than elite advancement. Education is central to this transformation. Scientific thinking, critical inquiry, evidence-based reasoning, and intellectual curiosity should be cultivated not just in laboratories, but in everyday life. But our education systems are increasingly designed to produce obedient workers, not informed citizens. Testing regimes prioritize rote memorization over understanding. School curricula are shaped by corporate influence, standardization, and ideological pressure. Science is presented as a body of facts to be consumed, not as a dynamic process of questioning. The result is not enlightenment, but intellectual submission. A truly enlightenment, inspired approach would place scientific education in the service of liberation, encouraging students to challenge assumptions, to investigate power structures, and to see knowledge as a tool for transforming the world around them. Moreover, science must be understood in its social context. Every scientific discovery has political implications, and pretending otherwise is a form of ideological mystification. When scientists claim neutrality while working for weapons manufacturers or oil companies, they abdicate responsibility. When policy makers cherry-pick data to justify cuts to social programs or deregulation, they weaponize science against the vulnerable. Enlightenment science was political because it challenged authority. Today, we must embrace that tradition, not to politicize truth, but to resist the ways truth is suppressed, manipulated, or commodified by the powerful. A society that takes science seriously must confront the institutions that distort it. Scientific workers themselves, researchers, lab technicians, data analysts, must be organized. The labor conditions in academia and tech sectors are increasingly precarious. Adjuncts work without job security. Researchers are pushed to publish or perish. Tech workers face burnout and surveillance. Just as industrial workers formed unions to fight exploitation, scientific workers must recognize their class position and demand democratic control over their labor and its products. This is not anti-science. It is the only way to protect science from the corrosive effects of profit maximization. When science is treated as a commodity, it cannot fulfill its enlightenment promise. But when scientists are empowered, organized, and accountable to the public, they can help build a society where knowledge serves emancipation. Science must also acknowledge and repair its colonial legacies. Western science often presents itself as objective and universal, yet it was historically used to justify empire, racial hierarchy, and economic domination. Indigenous knowledge systems were dismissed as primitive. Communities were subjected to unethical experiments. Resources were extracted in the name of development. A renewed enlightenment must include a reckoning with these histories and a commitment to epistemic justice. This means valuing diverse forms of knowledge, respecting cultural autonomy, and involving affected communities in every stage of research and policy. It means decolonizing science, not rejecting reason, but expanding it beyond the narrow confines of Eurocentric frameworks. Environmental science offers a vivid example of what is at stake. We face an ecological crisis of unprecedented scale. Yet our response is constrained by economic interests that view nature as a resource to be exploited. Scientific consensus on climate change is clear, but political inaction persists because those in power are more beholden to fossil capital than to planetary survival. Here, science becomes both a warning and a weapon. It tells us what must be done, but it also reveals who stands in the way. To act on this knowledge requires more than awareness. It requires organizing, resistance, and structural change. Enlightenment now means aligning science with ecological and social movements, turning knowledge into power and power into justice. Ultimately, reclaiming the Enlightenment means fighting for a science that is public, participatory, and emancipatory. It means breaking the grip of corporate control, challenging the false neutrality of institutions, and placing knowledge in the hands of the people. Science must be a collective endeavor, governed by the needs of the many rather than the profits of the few. Ladies and gentlemen, Humanism, once a radical affirmation of human dignity against the domination of kings, priests, and landlords, has been gradually stripped of its political content and transformed into a vague moral sentiment disconnected from the material conditions of people's lives. In the Enlightenment tradition, humanism meant the recognition that every individual possesses inherent worth, not because of their wealth, religion, or ancestry, but because of their humanity. It called for systems that respected life, promoted mutual respect, and fostered individual development. But in a world dominated by corporate power and economic inequality, such ideals have been emptied of substance and used as branding by those very institutions that violate them daily. Humanism has been co-opted by those who speak of equality while exploiting labor, who champion freedom while denying basic necessities, and who preach progress while perpetuating injustice. If humanism is to mean anything today, it must be grounded in the realities of working people, in the struggle for dignity, justice, and collective liberation. The language of human rights has been widely adopted by political leaders, corporations, and institutions, yet the structural violence that shapes our global economy continues unabated. Workers are paid starvation wages while producing vast wealth. Migrants are criminalized while their labor sustains industries. Women perform unpaid and underpaid care work that keeps societies functioning, yet remain marginalized and undervalued. The old forms of domination, feudalism, slavery, imperial conquest have morphed into new forms: wage exploitation, debt servitude, environmental displacement, and the commodification of every aspect of life. In such a world, to speak of humanism without addressing capitalism is to betray its core. Humanism cannot be abstract. It must be material. It must concern itself not only with civil liberties, but with economic structures, not only with legal equality, but with power relations, not only with moral appeals, but with organized action. True humanism demands that we interrogate who controls the resources necessary for life: land, water, housing, food, energy, and how access to these resources is determined. In most societies today, such essentials are allocated not by need, but by ability to pay. This turns life itself into a commodity. Human beings are reduced to consumers and laborers, their value measured not by their contributions to community or their creative potential, but by their productivity and profitability. This is not simply unjust, it is dehumanizing. A system that allows millions to go hungry while food is wasted, that lets people sleep on the streets while luxury apartments remain vacant, is not compatible with any genuine commitment to humanism. It is a system designed to prioritize capital over life. To reclaim humanism, we must struggle against the economic logic that normalizes such barbarism. Education, health, and culture, once considered the shared treasures of humanity, are increasingly privatized. Schools prepare students for corporate obedience rather than critical thought. Healthcare is a business, not a right. Art is shaped by marketability, not meaning. Even emotions are commodified as advertising and digital platforms manipulate attention and identity for profit. In this context, humanism must be more than an attitude. It must be a movement to reclaim the commons, to protect the public sphere, and to reassert that some things should not be bought or sold. This means defending public education, universal health care, housing rights, environmental protections, and free cultural expression. It means building institutions that are not beholden to profit margins, but accountable to the communities they serve. Humanism also requires an honest reckoning with history. The Enlightenment was not a pure or universal movement. While it challenged many forms of domination, it also coexisted with, and sometimes justified, colonialism, slavery, and patriarchy. Enlightenment thinkers often spoke of man in ways that excluded women, people of color, and non-Europeans. The task today is not to abandon the Enlightenment legacy, but to radicalize it, to extend its promise of dignity and equality to those it historically excluded. This means acknowledging the harm done in the name of progress and working to dismantle the legacies of imperialism, racism, and patriarchy that persist in contemporary institutions. It means centering the voices of the oppressed, not as passive recipients of humanism, but as its leading agents. A renewed humanism must also be ecological. The dominant human-centered worldview has treated the natural world as an external object to be dominated, extracted, and controlled. This has led to climate catastrophe, mass extinction, and environmental degradation on an unprecedented scale. But true human flourishing is impossible on a dying planet. Humanism must recognize the interdependence of all life and advocate for economic and social systems that respect ecological boundaries. This requires a profound transformation in how we relate to the earth and to each other. It calls for a transition away from fossil fuels, industrial agriculture, and limitless growth, and toward sustainability, care, and community resilience. Such a transformation will not happen through individual choices or market incentives alone. It demands political struggle and structural change. Solidarity lies at the heart of any meaningful humanism. In a world fragmented by competition, nationalism, and isolation, humanism reminds us that our liberation is bound together. The struggles of workers in one country are connected to those in another. The fight for racial justice is connected to the fight for economic justice. The liberation of women and LGBTQ people is linked to the broader dismantling of hierarchy and domination. Humanism means recognizing this interconnectedness and building movements that are inclusive, intersectional, and internationalist. It means rejecting the false divisions that pit people against one another, immigrants against citizens, public workers against private workers, the employed against the unemployed, and uniting around shared demands for dignity, justice, and democratic control. There is a danger, however, that humanism becomes little more than rhetoric. Corporations market themselves as people first. Politicians use the language of compassion to justify cruel policies. Tech firms promise empowerment while surveilling and exploiting users. This empty humanism must be exposed for what it is: a mask for exploitation. The test of any humanist claim is whether it challenges power, whether it lifts up the oppressed, and whether it builds collective capacity for self-determination. It is not enough to proclaim values. We must embody them in action, in institutions, and in systems. In this context, democracy must be understood not just as a form of government, but as a way of organizing all areas of life. Economic democracy, where workers have a say in the decisions that affect their lives, where communities control local development, where finance is directed towards social goals, is essential to any serious humanism. Political democracy without economic democracy is a shell. Voting every few years while enduring daily exploitation is not true self-rule. Humanism requires that we extend democratic principles into the workplace, the neighborhood, the school, and the economy itself. Only then can people exercise real agency and shape the conditions of their own lives. Humanism also involves imagination, the ability to envision alternatives beyond the narrow confines of what currently exists. It challenges the idea that there is no alternative to neoliberal capitalism, that inequality is natural, that suffering is inevitable. It invites us to dream of a world where everyone has enough, where life is not a struggle for survival, but a space for creativity, joy, and connection. This is not utopianism, it is a practical necessity. Every advance in human history has come from those who refused to accept the world as it was. Humanism gives us the ethical foundation to reject cynicism and resignation, and to commit ourselves to building a different future. This kind of humanism does not ask for charity from the powerful, nor does it wait for reforms from above. It grows from below, from the self-activity of people organizing in their workplaces, their neighborhoods, their schools, and their movements. It is not handed down by elites but built through struggle. It is forged in the resistance of those who demand to be treated as more than economic inputs, who reject systems that sacrifice their lives for profit, and who insist that a better world is possible and necessary.